For over 5 centuries, we have had people coming to the shores of America, be they explorers in the 1500s or immigrants today looking for a better life. But throughout that time, they have continuously added to American culture and helped change things through the course of time. Now, we have gone through and we've spent the last chapter talking about inventions, inventors, and how they have gone through and how they had an effect on American culture and the American population in general. Now we're going to take a look at the individuals to whom those changes actually had an effect. We're going to go through and we're going to talk about immigration. Now, immigration, for a lot of people, they think this only became a political issue in the last 20 years or so, when in fact you could argue immigration has been a factor going back to the 1840s with the Irish potato famine. So we're going to take a look at immigration in the late 1800s and how that had an effect on American. Okay, now we've got this first section is entitled Through the Golden Door. Now this ties in to a poem written by Emma Lazarus. It's at the base of the Statue of Liberty where it talks about, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, things like that. The last line says, I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So the golden door is essentially the entrance to America. It is a destination for which millions of people over the course of time have tried to pass through. And we're going to look, as I said, in the late 1800s at what was going on at that point in time. Now, between 1870 and 1920, so not long after the Civil War ended, and to the point just about the end of World War I, we had approximately 20 million Europeans immigrated to the United States. Now, these individuals came from all over Europe. Predominantly, however, there's going to be a couple areas of Europe where more people came than from others. Now, you have to take into account that during the course of the 1800s, I've seen some statistics talking about that upwards of half of Ireland moved to the United States, something like a third of Norway moved to the United States. So you're talking about really large shifts in population, that you are adding a great number of people to the United States and changing the makeup of American culture. Now, of these 20 million people during this 50-year period, a lot of them are going to come from Eastern and Southern Europe. So you're thinking in terms of places like Poland, Russia, Hungary, Italy, the Balkans, places like, it used to be Yugoslavia. And they're coming to the United States for a variety of reasons. Some obviously are coming just for the fact that they might have a better life. They might be able to make a better living. Now, there were a number of individuals, however, who came to the United States to try and escape religious persecution. Now, especially in Russia and Eastern Europe, in Russia you had what were called pogroms. Now, a pogrom was essentially an attack on the Jewish portion of a town. Where you would have, it was basically sanctioned by the government. It was okay, nobody really got in trouble for it. Fires would be set, people beat up, stuff destroyed, sometimes people would be killed. And this was all being done exclusively to the Jews living in that area. So there were those who came to the United States to try and find religious freedom. Now, there is a long history of people coming to the United States looking for religious freedom. You can go all the way back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims back in the 1600s. And it's no different here in the 1870s through the 1920s, or even to this very day. You had people coming to try and find, some way to freely practice their faith. A lot of people also came because they were poor. And when we're talking poor in Eastern Europe at this point in time, we are talking very poor. We're talking the epitome of what people would call peasants. These are folks who quite literally had nothing. And they sold what little they had. They gathered up everything they could in order to move from, Eastern Europe, somewhere in, a tiny village in Poland, for example, to pack up everything they possibly could, sell what they could, book passage, and somehow make it to America, because here the streets were paved with gold. There was always a better chance here in America. So you had these people who were coming looking for a way to basically improve their economic situation. They were looking at, where can I find work? Where can I find work that will allow me a decent living to provide for myself and my family? And they came looking for that improvement. Others came for political reasons. They wanted to experience the greater freedom that was available in the United States. There were a number of nations around the world at this time that were ruled by what are called autocracies. This is where you have a king or an emperor or somebody, one person who is in charge, period. And there had been revolts in the 1840s. There had been uprisings at different times and places. And there were a lot of people who realized that they were not going to be able to live the life they wanted. They were not going to have the freedom to choose anything about their national policy or how their lives are going to be run or what responsibility they had to the government. And so they came to the United States because the United States is the beacon of freedom. To this day, you still have a lot of people coming to the United States because of the freedoms that are provided in both the Declaration of Independence and especially in the Constitution of the United States. Now, for these 20 million, for these Europeans, the majority arrived on the East Coast. Okay, and that makes perfect sense. It was a much shorter trip to go west from Europe and arrive on the East Coast than it was to try and go all the way around the world and come up on the West Coast. So the majority are going to arrive on the East Coast. They're going to arrive in places like Boston and Philadelphia, but the biggest spot is going to be New York. New York is going to be where the vast majority of immigrants to the United States are going to land. And we will be talking later on about a place called Ellis Island. And a great number of people in this country today can trace their ancestors back to someone who actually passed through Ellis Island. So you're going to see a big change on the East Coast from these Eastern European immigrants. This is not to say that this is the only place where you're going to be seeing immigration at this point in time, but it is where you're going to see the majority of the immigration coming from Europe. Other people coming from other places are going to arrive in other portions of the country, but on the East Coast, you're going to see mostly Eastern European and Southern Europeans arriving. With all of that, let's take a look at another part of the world and another portion of the United States. So it wasn't just from Europe that you were going to see immigration coming to the United States. Like I said, that was predominantly what you were going to see on the East Coast, but that wasn't the only spot people were moving from. Smaller number of immigrants, not nearly 20 million, came to the United States from Asia. Now, just like European immigrants arrived on the west or the East Coast because it was a lot easier to do that, to just go straight from Europe to the East Coast, same kind of argument can be made in regards to immigrants from Asia. For the most part, they arrived on the West Coast. Now, it wasn't just the West Coast in terms of, like, say, California and whatnot. You also had a number of immigrants arrive in places like Hawaii and whatnot. But specifically, we're going to talk a little bit more about what was going on in immigration to the continental United States. Remember, this is a point in time where Hawaii is not yet a state, so it is a U.S. territory, but it's not a state yet, so you can kind of make that argument. So most of these individuals, these immigrants coming from Asia, are going to arrive on the West Coast. And between 1851 and 1883, so you're looking at about a 30-year period, you had somewhere in the range of about 200,000 Chinese immigrants arrived. They came for a variety of reasons. Now, remember, 1849, you've got gold discovered in California. You had people from all over the world rushing to California trying to get here. You had ships that were abandoned in San Francisco Bay because the entire crew deserted to head to the foothills to mine for gold. So you had Chinese immigrants coming around at this same time. Some for the exact same reasons. Some were coming, to become rich in the gold fields. Others were coming for a variety of reasons, just like we talked about previously. So you do have a large number of Chinese immigrants, we talked about this before, are going to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. Remember, we talked about that. We said that the Central Pacific started in Sacramento and headed east going through the Sierra Nevadas. And there were a lot of Chinese workers working on the railroad. I mentioned previously that they actually found out it was cheaper to hire people in China, bring them across the Pacific to work on the railroad, than it was to hire people in, say, like New York and bring them to the West Coast to work on the railroad. And so it was more cost effective, for lack of a better term. And so you had a large number of Chinese workers working on building the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of them brought family members with them as well, who would set up housing or businesses and whatnot in different places. And this was going to be one of the ways in which immigration would impact the West Coast. Now, 1898, the U.S. annexes the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, and with that, there were several thousand Japanese immigrants came to the United States. Now, there has long been a sizable Japanese population in the Hawaiian Islands, and a lot of them kept moving on to the West Coast. So you'll find that there were a sizable number of Japanese immigrants to places like California, plus a number of descendants of Japanese immigrants. This is actually going to end up causing some difficulties in World War I with the order, and we'll talk about this later, to actually put Japanese and Japanese American civilians into what were referred to as internment camps at the time, and we'll talk about that more. It was quite literally like a concentration camp, just about. There wasn't any, the torture and the death camp type stuff, but they were essentially put in prison out in the middle of nowhere. So you have on the West Coast a large influx of immigrants coming to the United States from Asia, predominantly from China and Japan. And both of these groups are going to end up having a long-term effect on the population of the West Coast, all up and down from California, from San Diego up through Washington State. And they're going to still be a fundamental part of the population today. In addition to all of these folks arriving from Asia and from Europe, we're going to talk a little bit about folks arriving in the U.S. from places closer to home. Okay, from 1880 to 1920, about the same time that you had those 20 million Europeans arriving on the East Coast, you had a little over 250,000, about 260,000 immigrants arriving in the United States from various islands in the Caribbean. We're talking about places like Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, etc. So you can think about all the islands that make up the Caribbean, and you're going to have a lot of folks, again, just like we're talking about with the Europeans and the Asians, they're going to pack up what they can, they're going to sell what they can, and they're going to board ships and try to make it to the United States. Now, again, people came from the Caribbean for a variety of reasons. One of the bigger ones, though, was still going to be economic. A lot of people left their homes in the Caribbean because of the scarcity of jobs. Okay, there was a much better chance of finding work, and what's more, finding work that would allow you to really provide for your family and whatnot in the United States. There were better chances in the United States at this point in time. And so as a result, just like we've seen from other places around the world, and we still see today, people were coming to the United States to participate in the prosperity that was available here. You also have immigrants moving north from Mexico. In the interest of full disclosure, my wife was born and raised in Mexico City. She moved to the United States when she was in junior high, and about 5-6 years ago became a naturalized U.S. citizen. So when it comes to immigrants from Mexico, I have some personal experience in regards to my own family. You're going to see a number of immigrants coming into the United States from Mexico as well. Now, some of these became U.S. citizens due to territory that had been acquired from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. 1848 we'd been at war with Mexico. We had captured Mexico as far south as Mexico City itself. And what we did was under the rules of war at that point in time, we quite literally could have just held on to everything we had captured, and that was now just going to be part of the United States. Instead, we did keep about half of what we had captured. Today, you're talking about areas of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California, Nevada, the Southwest, basically. And what we did was, we kept that. We returned everything else to Mexico. We wrote off some debt that they had owed us and things like that, and essentially, for lack of a better term, called it even at that point in time. Like I said, under the rules at the time, could have just held on to all of it, but as a nation, we chose not to do so. So the area that we did pick up as a result of the Mexican-American War, the people living there then became U.S. citizens as a result of where they were. Now, that's one set of immigration. What we're talking about here, what we're going to look a little more at, is the early 20th century, okay? From 1910, between 1910 and 1930, there was a great deal of turmoil going on in Mexico. This is the time of the revolution that was going on in Mexico. As a result, there were a lot of people who were trying to get out of Mexico because of the chaos and because of the turmoil that was going on there at the time. Again, this isn't the only reason, but this was one of the more predominant reasons. Of course, you still have others coming for economic purposes, a desire for more freedom, things like that. All the stuff that we've talked about equally applies to the folks arriving in the U.S. from Mexico. But we are looking at, for this 20-year period, about 1 million individuals arrived in the U.S. coming up from Mexico. And all of these different groups, you still have people arriving on a regular basis. As I said, a few years ago, my wife received her U.S. citizenship. I went to the swearing-in ceremony, and I believe there were 600 or 700 people who were being sworn in as U.S. citizens that day. And collectively, I believe they said they represented something in the range of 40 to 50 countries. So you had a large number of people from all over the world still coming to the U.S. to try and take part in the freedom and the prosperity that's here. Same kind of thing was going on then, same kind of thing is going on now. And so as a result, you're going to see some changes going on in American culture at this time. And this is just the beginning of how things were beginning to change.